This is the Triratna Dharma training course for Mitras. Compiled by Vedanya and produced by Sangaruchi. Music by Sarvadarshan. Hello, my name's Sangaruchi. This course is usually offered in Triratna Buddhist centres to small groups. I'm producing an audio version for anyone who can't get to a centre. Please listen to episode 1.1.0 as this gives an introduction. The course is narrated in text sessions, and in a subsequent question and answer session, I respond to anything people have sent me. Do send any questions. Year 1, Part 1, Week 6, the Buddha we can contact, questions and answers. Is devotion really the most effective method to communicate the essence of a quality? What about simply becoming? So I'm not exactly sure on the terms presented here. Exactly what is meant by the essence of a quality and also becoming, exactly what those things are, but I can probably speak to this to some degree. Understanding anything kind of requires to see it from lots of different angles. So if that's a physical object, it's simply from the left, the right, the top, the bottom, the front and the back. You look at it from lots of different ways. But even a physical object, and certainly other more complicated objects or ideas or processes, let's say, you'll probably want to look at them from an emotional perspective, a rational perspective. You want to look at social implications. You'll want to sense it in your body or with whatever senses you can, mythically, politically, financially, developmentally. Lots of different lenses that we can use. And all of these lenses will have different pros and cons. In some ways, knowing what lenses are most appropriate in what situation is probably half the battle, I'd say. I think devotion is not the most effective method of getting to know a lot of things. I'm sure it could be, but I don't think it's a sort of be-all and end-all lens through which to see everything. But I do think it's a particularly important one when you're talking about meaning and refuges and religion. I'd say devotion is kind of like your capacity to stay emotionally committed to something. It's not just commitment in terms of you turn up whether you want to or not. Devotion seems to be a bit more passionate or a bit more alive than that. Being committed to somebody or something is one thing, but being devoted comes across as more complete or deeper, maybe. And so when we talk of puja and other things like that, it's often called devotional practice. So it's not necessarily that you are devoted, but the act of committing to doing puja, let's say, the suggestion is that it brings about devotion in you. So I think particularly in relation to things of meaning, devotion is kind of essential. Exactly how you relate to that and how you generate that or how you work with that or observe it or engage with it. You might use puja, or you might use reciting the refuges in precepts, or you might use bowing to the Buddha, whatever it happens to be. It might be those things, or it might be something different. I don't know. I think the other factor that makes it quite useful to encourage is that I think we don't do it very readily. I think rationality is a very good way of engaging with things, and I think it's good to rationally check something out whenever you hear it or when you start to engage with it. I certainly wouldn't be a Buddhist or be part of the order if I was required to believe in anything that's irrational. So coming to the second part of the question, what about simply becoming? I'm not entirely sure what the term simply becoming means, but if that relates to a sort of embodied experience of something, then that to me would be a valid or, well, actually an essential component of comprehending something as well. Or maybe the word becoming, maybe that means something along the lines of observing what you become, observing a change in you and in the situation. So I suppose that would relate to looking at your experience over a period of weeks and months. And again, that's absolutely essential because you might look at something through a lot of lenses, and initially it sounds very reasonable and emotionally positive and, I don't know, politically positive and ecologically positive, whatever, but actually in the living out of it over a period of time, it shows itself not to be those things. And so then you've got a question on your hands of, do you continue to see it through in the hope that it will become that, or do you drop it? Have you ever heard of the idea of viewing all beings as bodhisattvas? I haven't heard that idea, but it doesn't surprise me as a method, let's say. So, as I've probably said before, none of the teachings that the Buddha puts forward are intended to give you a factual understanding of the universe or yourself. That's not what they're for. They are simply method. It's all method. Everything, every idea that he presents is not there to tell you how things are. It's to encourage you to use your mind in a particular way that alleviates suffering. So relating to all beings as bodhisattvas, I mean, just off the top of my head, I mean, there'd be some positive stuff from that. It kind of places all beings in an environment that you religiously comprehend, or places them in relation to human potential. It might place you in a position where you might respect people more, and it'd also possibly put you in a position whereby if anybody you find difficult or anybody you hate, you might be able to relate to them as presenting you a teaching on what you need to work on. I think there's a phrase something like, for all the virtue of all the Buddhas, not a single one has ever taught anybody forbearance. It's only your enemies that do that. I suppose there might be a few pitfalls to it as well. This idea of all beings are bodhisattvas. You might assume someone has a level of wisdom that they don't have. And I could certainly see that as being problematic. I suppose the other thing is other people might not want to be related to in that way. Yeah, the bottom line is something like that is methodological and can be very potent, but I wouldn't suggest that that is a description of how things factually are. Another example of that is that in meditation, to sort of keep good posture, it's sometimes taught there's a golden thread going from the crown of your head up into the sky, and it just gently pulls you, and that helps you keep an upright position. That's a view about the world that encourages you to respond to the situation in a way that's helpful. And that's a perfectly valid reason to have a view, I think. Can you explain who Padmasambhava was? So during the time of the Buddha, and for quite some time afterwards, India was generally a quite prosperous, relatively educated collection of organised and stable clans, let's say. I mean, they did fight between each other, but there was a relatively high level of civilization present in India for quite a long time, quite a sophisticated metaphysical and philosophical understanding. Buddhism thrived in that environment for over 1,000 years. And at some point, people started going to Tibet and trying to convey Buddhism. And it just didn't work. Repeatedly, people went there, and the story is that they tried to build monasteries. And every time they built a monastery, they put the stones together during the day and built up the walls. And every night, the demons would come along and dismantle the temples. So everything that they built during the day was undone by the night. And Tibet was a pagan, sort of shamanic people. They believed in black magic. A lot of them were nomadic. The situation was very, very different, like geographically, socially, politically. That the whole thing was quite different to India. Until along came a guy called Padmasambhava, and he's said to have tamed the demons in the land. We'll be getting on to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas a little bit later in the course, so I won't say too much about this, but Padmasambhava is sometimes called the second Buddha. It's likely that there was a historical figure called Padmasambhava. I doubt that he looked exactly like what we see in images, but this is a really tough guy, really. You look at him, he's got an upturned skull that's got ambrosia in it. He's got a staff that's got severed heads on the end of it. His name, Padmasambhava, means lotus born, or born from love, born from kindness, which is quite a juxtaposition from, well, what seems like a juxtaposition. And he's got a quite a terrifying stare, actually. This is what's needed to engage with the sort of darker forces. And by darker forces, I don't necessarily mean evil or bad, but these forces that come out at night to dismantle the temples. Nighttime is the realm of the unconscious. He's someone that goes into the unconscious, that goes into the depths. And you can't be meek in that. Very much linked with magic, eros, creativity, fearlessness, mystery, which was a much, much more potent method of engaging with those in Tibet than trying to teach them, complex Abhidharma from, Indian philosophical schools. Buddhism, whenever it goes to a new place, it relates to the people in that place, in the language and in the culture and in the way that they understand. And if you can't read, that's fine, we'll use images. If you're really invested in ideas, fine, we'll go more on the philosophical side. We'll be doing quite a bit more on the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas a little bit later in the course. It seems in the Buddha's times, teachings were accessible to all, whereas now it seems like a certain level of reading, reflecting, analysis, communication is needed. Would you say that today the Dharma is still accessible to all, including those who may find the more academic aspect challenging? So the word Dharma is usually used in two different ways. On a more mundane level, it means the teachings and the concepts and the ideas and practices that lead to a direct realization of the truth, or let's say an emotional acceptance of the truth, I think is probably a more useful way of thinking of it. And then it's also used in a higher aspect as a refuge, the way things are. I'd say the Dharma as a body of concepts is probably more accessible than it's ever been to more people. You know, we're generally more educated than ever before. We can read, which is a massive advantage. We probably have a lot more spare time if we really wanted it, which is probably a pro and a con, I think, of being alive today. If you spend your spare time well, it's probably a pro. If you don't, then it's probably a pretty big burden having spare time. We're also not faced with the constant threat of disease and death, which again, that could be a pro and a con, depending on how you look at it. We've got the internet, which means that pretty much anybody can listen to an hour's talk on any subject from the most qualified person on the planet. The amount of university talks or the amount of Dharma talks that you can get online is absolutely phenomenal. But by the same token, you can look at pretty much drivel for the same hour as well. So that's a pro and a con. And we can also listen to the teachings in our own language. Even today, there's over 120 languages spoken in India. What it would have been back in the Buddha's day, I have no idea. But to hear the Dharma back then, you would have possibly had to learn a new language and walk considerable distance where there were lots of animals that would actually eat you. We don't have monks and nuns now. So I'd say an advantage of that is that practice is not limited to a particular ecclesiastical commitment. Anybody can practice, regardless of lifestyle, which I think is a good thing, actually. It's blown the top off that. I think the downside to that is that because you don't have to have a particular commitment to learn the Dharma or to practice the Dharma, it might be easier to assume that we can actually gain insight without commitments or without renunciation or without radically changing your life. And I don't think that's true. So again, there's pros and cons there. I suppose one of the big things that is different is that we don't have the Buddha as a physical being, and that is a loss. But we do have I certainly have quite a weighty absence of that. There's a space for him, let's say, to the degree that that is actually a space for him as a person, as a physical being, or as a consciousness inhabiting a body, and the degree to which that's a sort of more mythical thing, a subtle expression of my own potential, I don't really know, actually. Being alive now, I do think, presents us with particular challenges and particular benefits. Certainly, if the person who wrote this question does find the more academic or analytical or the communicative aspect difficult, first of all, I would say that doesn't necessarily mean that you're bad at it. I did Mitra study with a close friend of mine, and I read the material and immediately picked it up. I was very, very quick. My friend struggled all the way through the first and second year that we did together, and he found it very difficult. That was about 15 years ago. What's curious is, in that period of time, my friend has brought up a lot of stuff in conversation, saying, do you remember in Mitra study this thing, how that was said and so on? And I can't remember any of it. I can pick it up really quickly and I can drop it just as quickly, whereas they pick it up very slowly and they actually retain it. Once it's in there, it kind of stays in there. Now, that wasn't obvious at the time, so I would say if you do find study difficult, don't assume you're bad at it. And the next thing is, if you do find study difficult, you just don't retain it and you don't understand it, and it doesn't serve much purpose. stick with it to the degree that you can, but don't worry too much about it. We've all got our strengths and weaknesses. I'm definitely not a natural meditator. And on one hand, that doesn't mean that I'm going to force myself to do an hour's meditation every day. But at the same time, I'm not going to let myself completely off the hook. Another aspect of this is there are lots of different ways to study. If this context is your only outlet for study, this is actually quite unusual, doing it online and doing it fairly infrequently and so on, and not having someone face to face. That is quite unusual. You can do it lots of different ways. You could just hang out with one person. You could go on retreat and do it. You could take a book on a solitary retreat. You could listen to talks. You could write essays on it. Maybe you could just ask yourself a question and keep that in the back of your mind, or written as a backdrop on your phone, that you just continually ask yourself for a period of 2 or 3 months. I don't think you actually need a lot of Dharma to live a Dharma life. I don't think it's actually required. I do think you probably need to be exposed to quite a few different ideas and get to know them to some depth, so that in the 50 different things that you understand, you're then able to accurately pick the best 3 or 4 that you actually need to work with your mind. For myself, I probably know lots because I've done the Mitra study course umpteen times. But in terms of what I actually use in my lived experience, probably use the Four Noble Truths, the Skandhas, the Lakshanas, and probably the precepts as well. But saying that, I'm ordained and I've taken 10 precepts, but generally speaking, I use the 5 precepts. I've been working with them a lot longer. I'll sometimes use the 10 precepts, but that's enough, actually. That is enough of a cognitive framework to be getting on with. You don't need to know everything. As I understand, the earliest Buddhist texts are in the Pali Canon, compiled after the Buddha's death, teachings passed down by his disciples. Is this a mixture of mythic and historical? And if so, does the text integrate the two and define which is which, or analyse it? So it is a mixture of mythic and sort of historical or actual, let's say. And the two are integrated in a way that they feature in the same story, and it's not explicit which is which. It's not like there's a little star in the border which says, now this is imaginative or now this is mythic. Though in a way I would say that that is kind of how things actually are. That ambiguity is literally how we experience life. The actual and the mythic, the pragmatic and the imaginative are not definably separate. They're more like 2 layers of experience that we can kind of tune into more or less, but neither of them ever completely go away. If you tried to engage entirely in the mythic realm, the imaginative realm, you're talking about a dreamscape there. That's your dreams at night. But even dreams draw from pragmatic reality. You know, you'll very rarely find something in a dream that's absolutely original and totally never experienced in your waking life. The mythic is imbued with the actual. And likewise, everybody that you actually engage with in your real life, they have imaginative and mythic significance. The people in front of you are not just physical objects and facts. They have a deeper significance than that. So a good example is that why should you want your parents to be proud of you? Why is it more important that your mother and father acknowledge you more than you want acknowledgement from any other person. I mean, maybe you do or don't, but you can get the idea. Why don't you feel that way about your neighbours? You know, they might be the same age and roughly the same social standing and affluence and character even. Like, they might be pretty much the same in every way, but your mother and father have a mythical significance in your life. They are not just people. They represent something to you, and they mean something to you. They have a role that is beyond their facts and figures, and even beyond your particular relationship with them, because you may have never met your father, but you would still have some kind of relation to that space, or you would have some conception of who they were, and it would not just be pragmatic. It couldn't just be pragmatic. If we simply related to things on pragmatic, factual basis, you wouldn't be a human being. Your eyes wouldn't be a human being's eyes. They would be the small, grey sensor on the back of a digital camera. That's pure pragmatism. That's seeing the world in a purely objective way and totally non-mythical way, let's say. With that said, just because life is on a continuum between actual and imaginal, and it's never fully one nor the other, I do think it's reasonable that we make some kind of distinction between the two. I don't think you can ever say that it is fully one and it is fully the other. And so there are hints that are given in the Pali Canon to suggest that what is happening is more of the pragmatic end and more of the mythical end. So the second question, if so, does the text integrate the two and define which is which and analyse it? So the term analysing that's used here, it does depend a bit what you mean by that. So in the Twin Miracle Sutta, which is in 1.1.5, which is the last one actually, the study text kind of elucidates that sutta in a technical way, but I don't think that's really an analysis of myth. It's an analysis of concepts. I understand why that's presented, because it's really important that we start to break it down in some way with concepts to understand myth. But I think that is a preliminary engagement with myth. I think if you continue to engage with the mythical element of the Buddha's life, or just the mythical element of your life, you actually kill it. If you do that too much, you end up destroying it. You know, it's a bit like trying to find out what a dog is like by killing it and doing an autopsy on it. So I think analysing a mythic text is not about sitting down and saying this is a symbol for this and that is an archetype for that and this means this and so on. That's a conceptual breakdown of it. That's not a mythical breakdown of it. You know, to really analyse a myth, to engage with what the myth really is, you need to be in your body. You need to speak to the figures in your meditation. You need to ask them for guidance. You need to look at the images. You need to paint the image yourself. You need to notice when those images arise in your dreams. You need to bow to those images or engage with those images on the level that they arise on. How you do that, there's a thousand ways to do that, and you just got to experiment, I think. Where did the mythic Buddha stories originate, and how are they recorded? So overall, the content of the Pali Canon, so far as we know, comes from the life of the Buddha. But what you're asking here is where specifically the mythic content came from, again, I think it just come from the Buddha's life. Whether people saw that, or whether that was put in at the point of it being retold, or whether that was put in at the point of it being recorded, I don't really know. How it was recorded is quite a miracle, actually. The Buddha lived it. For the last 3 or 4 decades of his life, he had an attendant called Ananda, who was his cousin. And Ananda had a photographic memory and was very fond of the Buddha. And after the Buddha died, there was the Great Council, and he recounted all of the stories to all of the monks present, a lot of monks present. And they then took each of the stories, they codified them into a sequence that made some kind of sense, and they formatted them into rhyme and meter so that they could be chanted and memorized relatively easily. Then groups of monks got together and they chose a certain number of these suttas to retain off by heart, and they chanted them together. They kept on chanting them together until they all got it right, and then they'd all go off, and then every now and again, I think it's over a period of years, this is so far as I understand, they would come back to the same place. If any of them had died, they would grab another monk, a new monk, and bring them into the circle, and they would continue to chant them until they all got them right, and then they would go off again. You'd just keep coming back to the same place at the same time every, I don't know how often it was, it could have been months, it could have been years, and you cross-reference the sutta across a good number of you. And it was transmitted like that for several hundred years, I think. Now that sounds pretty outrageous with our level of attention, but most of these people weren't literate. They couldn't write anything down to remember it. And even if you did write it down, you'd write it on palm leaves and they wouldn't last more than a few months in that climate. Some of it was written down on stone tablets or on walls and various other things, but obviously they erode after a period of time, and writing the entire Pali Canon on a wall, you'd need a pretty big wall. So most of it was done by memory. So far as I understand, this is actually a remarkably accurate way of recording information. Relatively soon, within a couple of hundred years after the Buddha died, somebody gathered all these stories and wrote them down and did actually record them. And I think that went off to China or somewhere, I can't quite remember. And then 200 years later, somebody recorded them and it went off to South Asia. And then another 100 years later, someone recorded it and it went off somewhere else. And so we've got, it's called the Pali Canon, but there is actually a Chinese canon and a this canon and a that canon. There's lots of different languages in which it's written all over the place. But what that has done is that's given a photographic image at this time, and a photographic image at this time, and a photographic image at this time. And actually, there's almost no difference between the records. So even though they were recorded at wildly different times, multiple generations between each physical recording, there's remarkably little difference between the Chinese version and the, whatever version it happens to be. Yes, scholars are relatively confident that there may have been changes made or additions made by choice, but probably very little was due to error. It says that it's not meant to be taken as historic truth. Does it say anywhere in the scriptures that it's not to be taken literally? I don't know. The scriptures are pretty big, so I don't know. There's nowhere that I can recall that it makes the hard distinction between historic truth and mythic truth. I think largely because the Pali Canon was never intended to particularly be either of those. It's not trying to tell you what factually happened. It's simply using any means that it possibly can to convey to you a different way of being. There are certainly places in the Pali Canon which actually go further than that, though. It doesn't just say that myth is not to be taken literally. It says all views are not to be taken literally. So no view, no set of words and no mental formulations and conceptions of any kind can ever do justice to the actual lived reality of life. It doesn't matter if, the Buddha had a DNA test and had a 4K video camera attached to his head for the entirety of his life, and it was absolutely bona fide, certified that this is exactly what happened. That would not be adequate at conveying to you the truth of what happened. Do other traditions take the mythic literally? So I don't really know about other traditions, so I can't really comment on how literally they take myth. Anecdotally, I do know that someone once asked Sangharakshita, are bodhisattvas real? And his response was, they are no more and no less real than you are, which I found quite provocative. I think my broader intuition is that it seems that more traditional schools of Buddhism don't see as much of a conflict between the historic and the mythic. I don't think they see that as a dichotomy in quite the same way that Westerners do. Why does the text relate to the language of myth to the unconscious? I suppose myth seems to be the language of the unconscious mind. I find myth not exactly physically literal, but I do think it can be emotively or intuitively literal. So I can't remember whether I've said this before, but for a long time I had a sense when I was with people, often strangers actually, that when I was with them I had a compulsion to either kiss them or hit them. And for a long time I told myself that was bad and I was wrong and this was what a terrible person I was. It took me quite a long time to understand that was a message from my unconscious, the place where dreams come from. It arose when I was being two-dimensional, when I was talking about a boring subject that I didn't want to talk about just to fill the time and to do social pleasantries. It arose when I was being facile. And the image was, if in that conversation you kiss somebody or you hit them, very quickly you have a real conversation with them. Immediately after that happens, a very direct conversation will follow. And so that image is not literally the thing that I needed to do, but that image is literally how I needed to feel. It's literally the kind of risk that I needed to take. When that image was in my mind of either kissing someone or hitting someone out of the blue, that is literally how my body needed to feel, that sense of exhilaration and activation that was needed to engage with the truth. And the truth was that I wanted a more substantial conversation and I didn't know how to have it. Myth is internally literal. So when you read that the Buddha rose up and became half fire and half water, as in 1.1.5, the last one that we've done, I do think you need to take that as literally true. You are there. This is exactly what factually happened. This was an actual lived event that historically unfolded exactly as described. When you read that, you do take it as true. But you only need to do that briefly, because now considering that is true, considering if you were walking down your local high street and you saw someone do that, what would you feel if you saw that? Really, what would you feel? Your very understanding of the world would be utterly broken. You'd probably be terrified to just behold that vision. You'd have nothing to stand on. And in the following days, you would completely question the reality that you have made for yourself. It would be world-shaking. Your conception of what human beings are capable of would be profoundly changed, and it would not go back. Okay, now that is literally the correct emotional response when you encounter an enlightened being. When you see somebody transcending all dichotomies. And once you've contacted that literal emotional truth, that intuitive truth that's behind it, after you've done that, you don't need to believe that it's factually true. So I had images of suicide for years, and until somebody said to me, suicide is the right idea, but at the wrong level, which really struck me. Because for a long time I thought that these were bad thoughts, but that's because I thought that I was inclined to act them out. The mythical thing that was coming up from my unconscious, the message that was coming up, I thought I was inclined to literally act it out. And of course that is dangerous. But the real truth behind it was that I did need to consciously and deliberately bring an end to my current existence, my current way of being, my current self. The life that I had needed to end, and in ending it, I would be moving into a completely unknowable space once that happened. And so death is an appropriately dramatic image for that. And that in that situation, I needed to take action to initiate that process, meant that it was even more specific. It was suicide. It wasn't just death, it was suicide. Now, that has changed. I very, very rarely get images of suicide in my mind, in my dreams, in my meditation. Just stuff pops up all the time. There's just, who knows how many images a day that we get. But much, much rarer are those images of quite abrupt suicide or death. And in some ways, I think since having a clearer sense of value in my life, or to some degree a conception of a path or a way forward, or even having people in my life who are further ahead than me, the images or dreams that come to me are of moving house, or being in a different religion, or getting a new car, or leaving a friend or leaving a partner and finding a new partner, or something like that. It's not as abrupt. It's not as traumatic. And none of those are physically literal. I don't need to move house, and I don't need to get a new partner, and I don't need to get a new religion. I just need to let go maybe of my crude conception of Buddhism and open up to a newer, more subtle and more helpful conception of Buddhism. Or maybe I need to let go of my ideas of my partner and open up to a more subtle understanding of them, or whatever it happens to be. Conflating the outwardly literal and the inwardly literal, I think, are really problematic. And I think the world outside and the conscious mind generally uses the language of facts, figures, and things like that. The collective and the unconscious world tends to speak in the language of myth, in the fantastical. That makes much more sense to the unconscious. And bridging that gap between the conscious and the unconscious, where you start to become fluent in both languages and know which is being spoken at any one time. And sometimes they're actually both being spoken at the same time. When you're having a conversation with your dad, you are both speaking the language of the world and the conscious mind, and you're also relating to that person in an unconscious, mythical way. They're not in conflict. They're often happening quite seamlessly together. It's just that we bring one more into focus and then the other. In daily life, we tend to be more focused on the conscious, and and at night when we have dreams, it's just it all goes a little bit crazy, but it just seems totally reasonable when you're in the dream. Who was Mara? So Mara is, I'd say, a personification of unhelpful doubt, and actually unhelpful confidence as well. So unhelpful doubt is inappropriately timed questions that indefinitely delay action. It's the need to be 100% certain before committing. That's a great one, that is. You'll never do anything. The requirement for perfection before stepping outside of your front door. It's vacillation that has no conclusion, the sort of mist and haze of anxiety. Prapancha, which is like cyclic thoughts, the same thought going over and over again. They're all sort of, they just shut you down, really. Mara only tends to arrive when you start to make progress, which is quite a curious thing. So if you're beset with doubts, that's usually because you're relatively close to a breakthrough. You're relatively close to making a new understanding, a new way of being, seeing something more deeply, let's say. If you're nowhere near that, then he just leaves you alone because you're doing his job for him, I suppose. So Mara is unhelpful doubt, but there are useful doubts. So the appropriate questioning of one's position, an openness to different approaches, and a sense of being able to handle uncertainty and to continue to move forward. A real question is always a good thing, but a question just to avoid what you need to do is not a good thing. In the same way that, every 3 months questioning your approach to study or to meditation or the way that you relate to your local Sangha or something, that's a really good thing to do every 3 months, maybe every 6 months, to sit down and really engage with that and think, actually, what could I do better? It's fantastic. You don't want to be thinking about that for 30 minutes of every single meditation that you do. It's just not appropriate. That's not a useful resolution of doubt. That level of questioning is not useful to you. Mara is unhelpful confidence as contrasted to helpful confidence. So unhelpful confidence is going for refuge to things that cannot be a reliable refuge. So, for example, eating food to avoid a sense of self-hatred in your belly. It's just not going to do it, actually. But again, helpful confidence is eating food to satisfy your physical hunger. That's a helpful confidence. It's good to be confident that food will do that, because otherwise you'd just starve to death. So I suppose Mara is the sort of smoke that, or the mist that sort of hangs around our vision, our spiritual vision, really. Not letting you identify what is useful and trying to get you to rely on things that are not useful. What does Koti mean? Koti means 10 million. Why did the Buddha need to call the earth goddess as witness? So if Mara is unhelpful doubt, neurotic propension, neurotic or misguided thoughts and perspectives, let's say, that kind of mindset totally thrives in speculation and fantasy. If you're ungrounded, that kind of haziness can just take you off, and you might be gone for a minute, you might be gone for the rest of your life. But what cuts through that, I'd say, is direct lived experience. So you won't get rid of doubt with a complex metaphysical argument. I mean, it's just nonsense. You need to be as direct and simple as you possibly can. Something very pithy, something unarguable. So it's quite noticeable that when the Buddha brings the earth goddess to witness, she doesn't argue with Mara. There's no argument there. There's no tit for tat, or, well, then there's this, and, well, I think he did. Because in the very process of arguing, you're sort of strengthening it. Or at least you're getting bound up in the argument. Images are good to cut through that, or direct sensations, or very uncomplicated quotes, short parables, things that are obviously directly lead you to a perspective on which the problem doesn't arise. So I can give an example for that. A couple of weeks ago, I was teaching a meditation class, and I had not meditated in a little while before that, and there were thoughts in my head of, I shouldn't be teaching this class. I'm not worthy. I'm not qualified. These people think that I've been doing meditation and I haven't, and that's not okay. Really undermining thoughts. And then every now and again there'd be a counter argument of, well, actually I'm ordained, I've got this caser, and there was this sort of toing and froing. Often the sort of doubtful thoughts were winning, but there was these two sides, and one side wanted me to pack up my bags and go home, because actually there would be some kind of comfort in that. And the other side wanted to maintain a position of, I don't know, skill or authority or validation, who knows. And of course there's a pleasure in that. And the bottom line is both sides just want to get what they want. It was just these two conflicting bits of me that kind of wanted different things. And that went on for a good 5 or 10 minutes. And at some point I caught it and I noticed what I was doing. And the perspective that just dissolved the entire thing was, what do these people need me to do? They needed me to ring a bell every 4 minutes. Can I do that? Yes. The whole drama was over. It was just very, very simple from that point onwards. It's not about who I am, whether I am worthy or whether I am not worthy. It's not about whether I'm getting the excuse to leave or the kudos to stay. It's just, it doesn't matter. You just need to ring a bell. It's fine. And so the earth goddess doesn't get into stories. She's a witness. She's not a prosecution or defense lawyer. She's a witness. What is happening here? And she says, he's done the work. And Mara just disappears. And just to bring in the faculty of that, to see beneath your own comings and goings, your capacity for truthful speech and being embodied, I think, is for me, it's very linked to the earth goddess. If you're not in contact with your body, you don't have that bedrock to stand on. Sometimes it's, do I do this or do I do that? And you're thinking up in your head. It's like, no, actually, what is my gut response to this? Oh, the answer's obvious. It's not the answer I wanted, because actually it's more difficult than I thought it would be. But there's something grounded about it. And likewise, if you deal in falsehoods in your speech and even in your own mind, if you dwell in fantasy, you're estranging yourself from the only thing that is robust enough to stand against that nonsense, the the propaganda of self and the washing machine of the mind. It can send you insane. You can go crazy with that. So you need something solid to stand on when the storm comes. Your capacity to not compromise on the truth, and your capacity to stay with the body, to stay with the earth, to stay grounded, doesn't necessarily let one side win or the other side win. It just cuts through the problem. It places you on a level where that is no longer a problem. What was the Buddha doing for 7 weeks after his enlightenment? So I'm not sure, actually. There's not a lot said about it. There's a few things said immediately after his enlightenment, but I suppose, I suspect he was absorbing the experience. My own experience of pretty small insights on a psychological level, just stuff about me, I suppose, is that they're often knocking on the door for weeks or even decades until I open the door. It only takes an instant to see them, or maybe a minute to see them. But then it actually takes some time to reconcile myself to them. Now that I've seen that this is true, or that this is the case, like, what are the implications? How must I now relate to things in light of that? What does this mean for my life and my relationships? How do I behave, considering that I actually find myself in an entirely different universe to what I was in yesterday? So that's not canonical. That is actually pure conjecture of me relating my own experience to the Buddha's. So that's probably to be taken with a bit of salt. The actual answer to that question is, I don't know. A Christian recently told me that the Buddha was an impressive man, but he didn't die for our sins. How would you speak to that? I suppose answering this question very, very plainly and simply, I think I'd agree. I think the Buddha was very impressive, and he didn't die for our sins. Although I think there's probably more behind that person's statement, and there's more behind the question as well. So I think what this Christian was actually saying was that Christ did die for our sins, and he opened the gates of heaven in doing so. It's sort of he was saying it that the Buddha didn't do that, but he's implying that Jesus did. And I think the other thing is, more broadly, I think maybe what's behind this question is, what do we do if someone invalidates or criticises one of our core values or views with a perspective that we don't think is credible? Or maybe even with a perspective we do think is credible. I suppose that could be included in the question. There'd be a few things that would precede any kind of response. Am I genuinely interested in this person enough to engage fully and properly? I think is probably the first thing. So anything like this is not going to be a simple conversation. If it is, it's going to be inadequate. So unless I'm really up for engaging fully, just don't go there, really. The next thing is, I'd say, when I hear that coming in, am I interested in trying to discern the truth? Or do I want to win? I suppose, because if I want to win, I may still want to have the conversation, but just be aware that actually what I'm trying to do is to win. It's not to come to a deeper understanding, Do I have the time? Do I have the patience? Do I have the subtlety to engage in it? And one of the things as well is, do I know how literally they are speaking? If they're taking this very factually, literally, that there is a God with a beard, he doesn't approve of gay people, and there is a literal heaven that is a permanent, and it's only been accessible since the day Christ died. Everyone before that went to hell. I find that bears little relation or relevancy to my experience. And that's quite an extreme. I mean, me saying that, I think very, very few Christians have that straw man conception of God. I don't think people have that today, really. And if they do, I certainly haven't met any of them, really. Maybe it's the circles I walk in, I don't know. But the other extreme, if when they're saying that, if their position is along the lines that Christ represents the ideal human being, a sort of something that's both fully embodied and fully divine, something highly elevated but still in a body. And he represents that ideal not because he represents a static state, but because he represents a faith in God, or a faith in another way of putting that. God, if God is a personification of reality, Jesus would represent a faith in reality and creation itself, or another way of putting it, a faith in creativity. And this faith allows him to give the proper perspective to suffering. And so he endures pain, he endures betrayal by his closest friends, he endures suffering and ridicule, death, like all of the things that are worst in the world, basically. And he does that willingly and with no hatred. And he does that because he has an unshakable belief that there is something beyond suffering, and that is worth not giving in to hatred for. And so, he willingly sacrifices everything. His wish for revenge, he's sacrificed, his entire life. He's willing to give that up. He will not lie to save himself, and he will not give in to hatred. And because of that, God, this reality, let's say, the personification of reality, he's reborn anew. God, or reality, rewards him for doing so, and rewards everybody who follows him, who imitates that, who takes that act deeply into themselves and uses it as the guiding principle in their life. Now, in that case, if that is the perspective that this person has, I would agree with them, and I would say that Christ died to reconcile sin, and he opened the gates of heaven in doing so. I mean, just very simply, great, totally cool. If you imagine that narrative is real, it will move you and teach you something about the nature of reality and liberate you from suffering to a degree. There's a profound truth there that has mythical, literal truth. So those are worlds apart. A God with a beard that doesn't approve of gay people, and this nuanced, emotive narrative that is profoundly true if you take it seriously enough. If you don't relegate it to the realm of mere fantasy. So there'll be a few other bits and bobs I might bring in. One is, to a degree, a sense of humility, really. That I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know that enlightenment is possible, and I don't know that there is or isn't a God. That's not something that I have direct experience of. And so I'd be very reluctant in any such conversation to say that God doesn't exist. I mean, I have no basis for that. I mean, I would also find it difficult to credibly hear somebody say that Christ was the Son of God, in a more historically literal sense, in a more sort of metaphysical sense. So I think if I expressed views, I'd be very, very careful. Well, hopefully I'm fairly careful anyway, but in this particular situation, I'd be very careful to express them as my belief. All things are impermanent is one thing, but I think I probably wouldn't say that in this situation. I'd say the Buddha said that all things are impermanent, or I could say I've not yet found anything that's remained unchanged, and I've done quite a bit of looking. Those things I can stand on. I kind of know that those things are true. The Buddha did say that all things are impermanent, and I have not yet found anything that's remained unchanged. Those are true no matter what anyone says. Those are my perspectives, and I can say that those are my perspectives with 100% confidence. Those perspectives might not be true, but still, yeah. Just the same as God is real is a very different statement to I believe God is real. Because I can't refute the fact that somebody believes that God is real. That is just a fact, really. But God is real, we get into pretty crazy territory pretty quickly, because it's just a statement that, well, you can't have a reasonable conversation about that in a way. I think there's an aspect of respect for the other person in that, to acknowledge that if you're faced with someone who has very different views, like sort of world views, sort of deep views, let's say, you are stood in two entirely different universes. The universe that you have is made up of your interpretation, generally speaking. It's not that much made up of your direct sense experience. And I think unless that can be acknowledged and respected by both parties, it might not be a useful conversation. Sort of in a way, letting the person be what they are first and foremost. If you start hacking away indiscriminately and crudely at things that they base their life on, they're probably going to be quite annoyed at you. And that annoyance is not necessarily an indication that their views are wrong. It might be that you're just being a bit of a douche. Yeah, you might just be insensitive, And I think with the respect thing comes a self-respect, that my belief doesn't require them to believe the same thing as me. A sort of self-confidence that that's all right, really. I mean, with that said, if you're going to enter a conversation with someone, and particularly over a period of time, if you're really going to enter genuine conversation, to some degree, you are going to have to offer your views and experiences and perspectives up to the table to be questioned. Like, it's not a very reasonable request of somebody else to both come into a conversation and you entering the conversation thinking, I'm simply not going to change what I think, but they should change what they think. I mean, it's just a bit of a miserable conversation, really. If you're going to expect them to question their own perspective, you have to honour that. And I don't think this is anything necessarily to do with Buddhism or not. I think this is just being polite in conversation, really. In situations like this, I do find that things can get polarised a little, a lot, in that the view that Christ died for our sins, it doesn't seem to be literally experientially observable or based on rational deduction or historical account. If someone has come to that conclusion, you can't easily refute them with experience or reason, because it's quite likely that they never used experience or reason to form the view in the first place. And you often get this online. It's people having theistic views or faith, and people trying to bait those people and those views into a boxing ring that is made of Newtonian physics, let's say. They're trying to lure them into the scientific realm and then beat them with science. And it's just not very appropriate. It's like trying to say that my artwork is better than your artwork because my artwork has 14 different colours and yours only has 10. You're applying the wrong lens to engage with the person. You're applying a lens that they can't defend themselves against, but they don't really want to or have no need to. The reason that they're doing what they're doing is not because they logic. You can't use the laws of physics to judge an artwork, in the same way that you can't use economic theory to prove that a bird is good at flying or not. Yeah, broadly speaking, I'd say, their view could have been put there through indoctrination, and people often just assume that, and I don't think there's reason to. But if it is through indoctrination, I'm not interested in that. It could be put there through culture, and I may be interested in that. But if it's there through an intuitive, emotional response to a narrative that speaks to them of truth, of what it's like to be alive, I'm just totally interested in that. Even if I don't end up agreeing with that view being of value for me, or I might even think that view's not of value for them, depending on depending on how they're conducting themselves. But even so, I'm interested in it. So broadly, if somebody presented me with this, if the option for this conversation and to speak to this was available, I'd be reluctant to get involved in it unless I was genuinely interested and had the resources of time and sensitivity around me to actually engage with this person in a way that was able to reach where this view came from, and also have the perspective in myself to go to where I come from at that level. Because I think anything less and you just end up with, Facebook battles. The world is not short of them, really.